Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our final annual presentation of our Medication Safety Clinical Forum. We're very excited that everyone could be here. So we're getting started just a few minutes late, so let me turn it quickly over to our presenters, Heather Stanley and Juliet Formosa. Take it away.
Great, thank you. We are here this evening to present on how to monitor patient safety with technology. And my name is Heather Stanley. I am currently the Medication Safety Coordinator at Advent Health Orlando, and also our Residency Program Director for our PGY 1-2 program in Medication Use Safety and Policy. And I'll go ahead and let Julia introduce herself as well.
Hi, good evening. My name is Juliet Formosa. I am the Health System Medication Safety Officer for Jackson Health System, and I'm the Director of Pharmacy at Jackson West. Thank you.
Great, we're excited to be here with you all this afternoon and ready to get started. So for our presentation today, neither of us have anything to disclose. Our objectives for this evening are how to analyze alerts and name strategies to reduce alert fatigue, identify risk points when relying on technology, and also to recognize technology support within the medication use process. So I'm going to go ahead and start us off with a little bit of the background. We're talking about technology and process improvement, but it definitely is a give and take. We have technology within the healthcare system, and it does solve a number of problems for us. We are looking for that process improvement, and a lot of times trying to look for those hard fail-safes within our technology. And while it may help improve a certain process, it also can introduce new error types. And so we're going to be talking about that balance between technology and what our responsibility is in terms of monitoring it and making sure that it is acting as intended. So some of the risks that we might see within technology in our healthcare system and the medication use process may be workarounds or drifting behaviors, also bias and complacency. These are the overarching thoughts of risks that we may be getting into, but we'll go further into detail into some of these as we start to talk about the specific technologies and also what benefits they may have, but also what possible error points they could introduce. So we're talking about technology, and when we're thinking about process improvement, we're normally talking about some steps within the medication use process. So just considering this, the lifespan of a medication within our health system. And our different technologies, a few that we'll touch on today, they act on this process at different stages. So we may talk some about the transcribing or prescribing stage. Maybe it's more order entry technology. And then also we may see some dispensing stage opportunities for improvement within technology, like with our automated dispensing cabinets. And of course, even as pharmacists, we do play an important role at the administration stage, working closely with nursing leadership to look at actual administration of medications, whether it's barcode scanning to ensure the right patient and right med, or like smart pump infusions and making sure that we have those programmed correctly for what medication is running. So we're talking about process improvement, talking about technology, and looking at opportunities. We see that the system as a whole really does have opportunities for change, and it needs to support our people that are using the system. So you can see here in the visual on the right, this is a hierarchy of risk reduction strategies. So we're looking more at the top. What is more effective to have risk reduction? And we're seeing forcing functions, automation, and computerization. So we're talking about technology. This is telling us implement technology to help reduce risks. And that is something that we're following and we are trying to stay cognizant of, but the basis of a lot of this presentation is meant to also show that while we're trying to implement these standards, that there may still be opportunity for ourselves to keep an eye on what changes are being made and what follow-up and improvement we may even be able to continue to make related to technology. So for our first objective, we are going to talk a little bit more about that prescribing stage. So looking at alert fatigue, how you may analyze alerts, and then also reduce some of that associated fatigue. So when we're talking about alerts, our first step here would be grabbing our attention. Something has popped up on the screen. Next, we would want our clinician to make a decision on that alert. And that is where we're starting the basis of actually building out alerts. So these are clinical decision support systems. At this step in the medication use process, you have providers entering orders or you have pharmacists verifying orders. And we're looking to have real-time interaction with that user. What about this step in the medication use process might we want to alert them to? And the intention of alerts are to improve patient safety. We have a visual here of a medication warning. So this may be what it looks like in the electronic health record. We have verified orders that are associated on the right-hand side, and then we have what order is trying to be verified and some of the warnings that may be associated with it on the left side. So you're looking at potential interactions and trying to make clinical decision at that time. So this is a support tool for that. But another type of alert could be a best practice advisory or some type of pop-up about the specific order that you're entering. So maybe it's a reminder. This patient has a certain order, but they also maybe meet criteria for a different type of order. At this time, it's asking you to accept or cancel the process that you're trying to move through. So these are just two types of examples of alerts that we might see at this step in the medication use process. So we're talking about alert fatigue, and those two types of alerts that we mentioned, they have their place in practice, absolutely. We saw that on that hierarchy of risk reduction strategy, forcing functions and automation are aspects of being more effective in reducing risks. But what about too many alerts? This is just one step of the medication use process. It's just one step of the pharmacist process or the provider's process. And so in this situation, we would say that more is probably not better. It's not that if you show all of the information, you're going to get a response to everything that is listed there. You may have an information overload. And now, where you thought you were going to have the provider alert and oriented to what you've put on the screen for them to react to, now you have a little bit of a desensitization, perhaps. They're so used to getting multiple alerts, they're not actually reading all that it says. So that conditioned behavior to start ignoring what is coming up at that step in the process. And so with that, we're starting to get away from our attention and decision, which is what we would hope would come after the alert populates. So when we talk about medication warnings, it really could mean a variety of examples. And we're saying here that perhaps not all of them need to always fire, that whole concept that more is not always better. So we have drug, drug food, it could be drug disease, duplicate therapy, it could have to do with the patient's age, duplicate medications. And you could see how this list could very easily get long. And also, likely you can or have your own examples already of what alerts you may see at your facilities that do seem to be aspects of fatigue, that they don't seem to be actually warranting a response. And so you don't really have action taken on them, but they're another step you have to just go through. So how might we start to rethink our take on alerts? So what if we took all of that data of what is alerting in the electronic health record to look at which warnings are populating and then being overridden? So we know that once that alert populates, there is an option to either accept, override. It may have varying titles, but you get the idea. So if we're running that data and we're able to find out which medication warnings are being overridden, that may give us a starting place of where we could focus our efforts on what may be causing fatigue. What alerts aren't giving us that positive aspect that we thought they would? So talking about the impact of those alerts, whether they're drug disease, different warnings with a panel that's interdisciplinary is key. So we know that these alerts are not normally just seen by pharmacists, but that could be the case. So talking about who they're impacting gives us a lot of background on whether or not they are impactful. And then from there, customizing those problematic alerts that have been identified would help improve the overall process with those warnings. We want to be able to make approaches that are improving the process and making sure those alerts are actually actionable instead of just a nuisance. So this is a great idea, but how do we actually get started on it? We talked about getting the data from the electronic health record. So that's a definite proactive approach. Look at some of the number of alerts overridden versus the number of alerts acted on. And that may show you what alerts may actually need to stay and which ones may be able to get that interdisciplinary group review and possibly be eliminated or improved upon. But you may also want to ask your end users, what are you seeing that is bothering? What are you going through every day with order verification? A lot of the times they're who's doing this constantly, and so their feedback is really helpful. At our facility, we were actually able corporate-wide to have a ticket option for clinical decision support requests. And this gives the opportunity for the end user to submit a request directly to a group who is going to then review those reports and see, are we maybe already working on that in our proactive approach? Or is this something that's not hitting our data and does really need to be addressed? And this starting place of these line items of opportunity for improvement shows you what your next steps may need to be. So now you have your reports, now you have your ideas for change. Where do we go from there? And this is a busy visual, but this is what our corporation came up with. And in summary, it's from that last slide. So we're getting data or we're getting end user reports. We're having pharmacy informatics go through those reports and categorize them for the work group for clinical decision support, where we will then get impact review from informatics, safety, and clinical. So this is more of that interdisciplinary approach, pharmacy-wise, to what may need reviewed. Based on those groups' feedback, it may be accepted or denied in terms of the request. So from there, you would start to follow your own facilities or corporation's process for change. What does that look like if you're trying to impact change in the actual electronic health record and with those alerts? And then continuously sharing the feedback back where it came from. Is this a win? Are we sharing that we've improved the system and we want increased reports? Or did we take a proactive approach and eliminate hundreds of nuisance alerts every day from the workflow? We want to make sure that we share that back with the staff, because this is how we continue to improve the process and show that we are a culture related to medication safety and process improvement. So this is just a short summary of alerts and moving forward, where you may be able to go with your own organization and how to formulate those thoughts and ideas and get their feedback to go ahead and move forward with opportunities for improvement. And I'm excited that Juliet is actually going to share with us an example.
Thank you, Heather. So this is an example of applying successful strategies. So we don't always have to reinvent the wheel. This was a study that was published in 2012 on drug-drug interactions that should be non-interrupt so that we can reduce alert fatigue in our electronic health records. This was one academic medical center that looked at 6 months worth of interruptive alerts ranging from all types of severities. But the key was that these alerts had been overridden by the provider, and there was no documentation reason necessary. From these, they organized them into drug-drug pairs, either between drug class or class. And out of those, they targeted the ones that were 90% of the time overridden. And what they found was a list, and that list was taken to subject matter experts, including the FDA and FSHP. And out of that list, it's on the right-hand side. It is a table of the low priority drug-drug interactions that are recommended to be suppressed in interruptive alerting. So from this, we did a real-world application where we reviewed it in a multi-hospital health system. Using that same table from Fansalkar et al., we reviewed the alert logs for 12 months from any class interactions that were available within our electronic health record formulary. Out of these, we identified over 1,000 drug-drug interaction pairs. From those, we asked IT, we collaborated with IT to only look at the ones that had been fired within the last 12 months. And this essentially excluded the majority of them. So within the last 12 months, what we found was that there were 23 drug-drug pairs that had been alerting and overridden from the table. We then took this to our clinical decision alert analysis task force committee, and we discussed the severity of these interactions, the frequency of alert, and we received recommendations from our experts. And the conclusion was that from the 23 reviewed, there were 12 drug-drug pairs that were recommended to not fire. So essentially 50% of the ones that were reviewed, we were able to reduce unnecessary alert fatigue. Next slide. And so on for question number 1, what are some of the reasons to use clinical decision support systems? Number 1, to assist with clinical decision making. Number 2, to improve patient safety. Number 3, pharmacists do not participate in building these types of support systems. Or number 4, both 1 and 2 are correct. And we're getting some answers in the chat, so that's correct. Number 4 is correct, assist clinical decision making and improve patient safety. I'm going to hand it back over to Heather for our second objective.
Great, thank you. I think that was such a great, impactful story, talking about how you took this study, brought it to the facility, originally had over 1,000 line items, which could seem super overwhelming, but then said, let's make it impactful. What's actually been firing in our facility? And then we're able to make those adjustments. I think that was a great example, and I appreciate you tying it all together for us. So we're moving on now to identifying risk points when we're relying on technology. I touched on it a little bit earlier, but these are some other medication safety technologies at other steps in the medication use process. So medication barcode administration, or BCMA, is the scanning of both the patient and the medication prior to administration. We also have smart infusion pumps. So our medication infusion pumps made smart by having a drug library with limits, and then also automated dispensing cabinets, and talking about that functionality with the dispensing step of the medication use process. So let's start off with BCMA. Why should we focus on BCMA? This is a landmark study that was from over 25 years ago, and it hasn't been reproduced. And the feedback from this type of work is that we may have eliminated some of the transcribing issues and worked on CPOE and having providers use the computerized order entry. But when we're talking about the administration step, we see here that 39% of the errors may occur at this stage, 51% of those resulting in harm. But the idea that only 2% were intercepted at that stage in the medication use process is a great example of why we would focus on barcode scanning for both the patient and the medication. So what are some of the benefits of BCMA? It is one of the most vulnerable steps in the med use process. We have all the steps leading up to administration, and then that's when the patient is ultimately going to be given the medication. So we reviewed that it is the step that's least likely to catch the error without some type of technology assistance. But BCMA, that's where it comes in to help intercept those errors. Studies have shown that BCMA can reduce medication errors by 65 to 86%. And it's important to note here that the idea is not just barcode scanning in general. It does have to be used consistently and correctly to actually reduce those medication errors. So we're talking about the process of BCMA and scanning the patient and the medication prior to administration. So what are some of those workarounds? That drifting behavior, which we mentioned, is a risk associated with technology. So we could see that there isn't scanning of the patient or medication. You may have a scan of one medication barcode multiple times for the same medication, hoping that everything you have sitting there is actually that same medication. You could have a stand-in barcode. Maybe you've just kept one of those multi-dose barcodes on your Windows on Wheels, and now you're using it consistently, whether or not that's the drug in hand. Also, the piece about scanning prior to administration, we could have scans after administration. While that would still show an error, it wouldn't have prevented it for the patient. So these are just some of the examples of workarounds that we see. And then drifting behavior may also be just ignoring alerts. So maybe you scan the patient and scan the med, and the med pops up and says, this order is not on the patient's MAR, and you override it because you believe it to be correct. And then similar to using a decoy barcode, you maybe don't have the workstation at the bedside. Maybe you're charting outside the room and then bringing all the medications in and not actually doing it one by one with the patient there. So I'm going to go ahead and let Juliet go a little bit more into that process of drifting.
Thank you, Heather. So why do we drift? Well, Heather already explained that drifting is a part of healthcare that we see, unfortunately. And the reason for this is because sometimes there are rules that are perceived to not make sense or that impede productivity or workflow. So unfortunately, in healthcare, there is some sort of, it's seen as an acceptable amount of drift. And it is normalized because if it happens repeatedly with no outcome of patient harm, there is a false sense of belief that the harm will never occur to these patients. This belief is also seen where there is no error because this person, this healthcare provider, is good at their jobs and they do not make mistakes. So areas where we can see this type of workaround or this type of drift are in failure to check patient identifiers prior to administering medications, because we know this patient, we've seen this patient before. Failure to follow personal protective and infection control practices, such as hand washing, because we've been in this unit before and we haven't gotten sick. So we have a sense of, I don't need to wash my hands, I will not get sick. There's also latent errors. So these are system design defects that they're underlined, they're not as easy to identify, but this is defects in the system, in the environment, or in the technology that lead to a normalization of working around or behavioral drift. Examples include a failure to confirm the name of the medication that is in your hand because it has been dispensed from the automatic dispensing cabinet. And so there's a sense that I already read the label, I already read the name of this medication from the machine, I don't have to look at what is in my hand. A newer hot topic is absence of barcode scanning technology and access of EHR in a radiology setting or in an operative setting. So again, this is a system design defect that can lead to workarounds on what we know should be done. So what are the recommended courses of action? Well, first, to fully commit to safe and reliable care, we need to acknowledge that there is a propensity for behavioral drift in humans and in healthcare. And we also need to consistently anticipate what might go wrong and what can go wrong with technologies before we implement, before we upgrade when there's advances available, or before we make changes to interface. So back to barcoding. Well, luckily for us, we are in an age of automation where we don't just have barcoding with BCMA at the point of administration, but throughout the medication use process, there's barcoding that's available to allow us to have a focus on patient safety. So for example, upon receiving, medications should be scanned when received from the wholesaler to make sure that they are linked with our EHR and that they are linked with our automated dispensing cabinets and there's no errors down the line. For preparing and checking medications, there's availability of IV scanning, of checking and tracking technology. When delivering, whether it's hand delivered, loaded on an automated dispensing cabinet, or tubed, if there's tubing functionality, there is tracking that can be done and scanning at the bin and the medication. And then, of course, we already went over the administration piece with the right patient and right medication. The reminder here is that technology is only a tool, and we should always be training our staff and other healthcare providers to read and follow alerts and to read order comments, and always to physically review the medication that's in our hands. So again, technology is a tool and it can fail. So for example, we can focus on strategies of safety around power plants, order sets, barcode scanning for medications when we deliver, barcode scanning when we administer. However, we as humans can have errors. So just because something scans, the wrong information could have been added, therefore no alerts fired. By alert fatigue, so we bypass that alert. There's an emergency, and so we override a medication. There is no BCMA to scan, or so many alerts have happened that the one important alert is now missed because of alert fatigue. So again, the training should always be medication errors can happen, and we want to train staff to look at what they are verifying, ordering, dispensing, anything across the medication use process. And so here are some examples of pitfalls in barcoding. So in this case, there was barcoding available, but this is an example where there's too many barcodes. This is a premixed heparin drip that is now unavailable to this health system because there's a shortage. The hospital notifies their staff that the heparin drips will be prepared by pharmacy. Because they are prepared by pharmacy, there's a final product with a standard pharmacy label saying that this is now a premixed heparin drip. The nurse that receives this drip calls the pharmacy and is concerned that the heparin is scanning as 0.9% sodium chloride and not as heparin. So in this example, how many barcodes do we see that are visible? So on the picture on the right-hand side, what we see is that the nurse was scanning the original barcodes from the manufacturer in the bottom rather than the 2D barcode that was printed on the label. So the barcodes in the bottom from the manufacturer were associated with the 0.9% sodium chloride rather than the 2D barcode that said this is now a heparin. So the way to anticipate and to communicate and prevent errors here would be communicating any changes with staff when we change products, anticipating what can go wrong when visually the product is different, and then always listening and taking concerns seriously from staff when they report it. In this second example of a pitfall, in this case, the barcode was working, but it was working for the wrong patient. So this is patient AR. They received a multi-dose inhaler while they were in the hospital. This inhaler was labeled specifically for this patient, and it was stored in the secured bin in the patient's room. Patient AR is now transferred, but that secured bin was not checked. So the inhaler was not transferred with patient AR. Now patient BF has been moved into that same room. Patient BF has a new order for the same exact multi-dose inhaler. However, it has not arrived from pharmacy yet. The respiratory therapist arrives to that patient's room, removes the multi-dose inhaler from the secured locked bin, and now when they go to barcode, the barcode scanning is successful. The patient's wristband is scanned and it is correct. It is for the right patient. The inhaler barcode is scanned, and because it is the right drug, it associates as right drug and doesn't alert. However, this inhaler is not specifically labeled for patient BF. The label says patient AR. So again, there's a pitfall here, and the way we prevent this pitfall is by sharing. So we always should be encouraging reporting of errors, investigating those root causes. Why did this happen? Educate on the risk by sharing stories like this with risk management, with respiratory therapists, with nurses and pharmacy, and then always focus on lessons learned. Again, physical review of the medication label. And I will turn it back over to Heather to talk about smart pump benefits.
Great, thank you. So moving along in our medication safety technology, where we see at the administration step, we may have this impact, are smart pumps. So we have benefits here for sure. They're eliminating the need for math. They are allowing the drug library to have identification of some possible errors with programming. Also, it could alert the staff knowing that the pump was programmed for 250 mLs and it knows what the rate is. And so if that bag is starting to run out, it can alert, and then there would be the opportunity to act on that need either for a new bag or to remove it once complete. And it also, the drug library also gives the opportunity to align with the hospital standards. So it may be concentrations of infusions, it could be duration of infusion, whether the standard is for extended infusions or short infusions. Those library parameters, when input, show what may be alerted in terms of too fast, too slow if the nurse accidentally programs incorrectly. Also, this is a technology that can have data reported out from it. So we can also be a little bit proactive in our review, even like the alerts. What's being overridden in the drug library? What are we seeing with utilization? Is the drug library part of the nursing workflow? So this is an example of something you may share in terms of the why related to smart pump drug libraries. We're trying to say that this is a safety technology, and so when should you use it? Always. We have goals associated with use. Also understanding that whole balance of technology being a give and take, that smart infusion pumps are not smart on their own. It is in collaboration with the user actually interfacing with the pump, and you utilizing the drug library is what may prevent some of these misprogramming errors. So bottom right hand has some examples of great catches from the drug library use. Hopefully that's hammering home that the intention is to use this safety function. But also bottom left, what if it's not in the drug library? Obviously, there's a need for patient care. And hopefully this is part of the process to grab a friend and verify this medication if needing to go outside the drug library, but also escalating that. We need to have it added, we need to have it addressed. And so having that buy-in that the drug library is a technology to work in tandem with, not just solely rely on, which does lead us to some of the workarounds or drifting behavior. So again, it's used in tandem with the clinician. It is not that everything that the pump may say is correct for this order or for that specific patient. So the programming of the right drug and using the actual drug library is part of using that technology correctly. An obvious workaround may be just infusing a medication with no pump, not even regardless of the drug library. And then another aspect also may be related to smart pumps, that while having a drug library at baseline has the nurse interact and manually program infusions, there may be an opportunity for interoperability, which is where the electronic health record actually tells the smart pump how to program. And so that's another level even of support within the technology, but that may be bypassed or not used, or you could have issues with scanning. So maybe you're hanging another bag of maintenance fluids, you're just going to scan the one that's already empty and hang the new one. That's not confirmation that that new bag that's being hung is the correct medication. So these are just some examples of smart pump workarounds. And so for another real world example, I'll head it back to Julia.
Thank you, Heather. So this is stopping the pump drift. This was an incident report that was identified as an increase in trend in a pediatric ICU. The events that were reported were specifically related to wrong rates in this pediatric ICU. So an investigation revealed that nurses were bypassing alerts. This led to a review of 3 months worth of pump alert data that showed that there was an increase in the overrides specifically for Prestigex and IV fluids. Next slide, please. And so in looking at this, the first one that was identified was IV fluids. What we can see here is that the rate that nurses were programming within these 3 months were very close to 500 or at 500. And the heart max that was built into this pump library was a heart stop of 500 mLs. So taking this data and bringing it back to frontline staff, the question asked to the nurse leads was what fluids were being given that were running at a maximum of 500 mLs per hour. And what the nurses reported was that these were IV bolus doses. So what was discovered was that in this smart pump library, there were 2 settings. One was for IV fluid bolus, and this entry did allow for a heart max up to 1,000 mLs. However, there was an IV fluid that was an entry with a heart max of 500 mLs. So what was identified here was a goal to reduce behavioral drift by the nurses in the pediatric ICU by reducing unnecessary overrides when they were stopping at 500 mLs. And what was agreed upon was to increase IV fluids to the heart max of 1,000 mLs, just like IVF bolus. Next slide. And in looking at Prestigex, again, it was identified that highlighted in yellow, nurses were going up to 1.6 micrograms per kilogram per hour. However, there was a soft max that would alert every time the pump went above 1.5. So in a soft max, it did not stop the nurse, but it did cause an alert every single time. And again, looking at those 3 months, it was every time that Prestigex was used, it was titrated up to above that soft max. So in this case, this was taken to the pediatric ICU physicians, and they did confirm that doses were commonly titrated to pass that soft max. The goal to reduce behavioral drift was to reduce unnecessary alert override, and in this case, that meant increasing the smart pump soft max to 2 micrograms per kilogram per hour for Prestigex. And I'll hand it back to Heather for ADC benefits.
Thanks for wrapping up smart pumps. I think those real world examples do just give us a better idea of where we may see these actions at work. So talked a little bit about, we'll go briefly a little bit over it more, but automated dispensing cabinets. We have a functionality at this technology step for dispensing. So we have the ability to have medications on the nursing floors. You're not having nurses perhaps call and ask for doses as frequently. They're getting them more in real time. You have data on how much stock you may need to keep where. And so this productivity is improved and gives us more drug tracking capabilities. But with our previous technologies, we see it with ADC as well. There are workarounds and drifting behavior. So we may have nurses at the automated dispensing cabinet removing multiple patients' medications at once. Now we may find ourselves in one of those situations similar to the inhalers. Which group of meds is whose? And now we may be relying more heavily on barcode scanning when this is a workaround in this process of technology. Also, more than one dose being removed for one administration, that anticipation of dose. So we may have doses being carried around the hospital instead of ready for immediate administration. Also, we have override capabilities within automated dispensing cabinets. So maybe the nurse is not using the medical record and they're overriding what they believe to be the order, and also maybe overriding for just convenience of having the medication available when it wasn't really emergent. So there are multiple workarounds and drifting behaviors that we might see related to automated dispensing cabinets. We still have to interact with them in order to make that technology a true safety feature. Even at the stocking stage, where Juliet also mentioned we have barcode scanning, but what if we're inputting the incorrect expiration date? The automated dispensing cabinet, it doesn't know that. So it is a give and take with this technology as well. And that brings us to question number 2. So smart pumps, automated dispensing cabinets, and BCMA are all fail-safe processes that lead to 0 medication errors. True or false? Great. Seeing a lot of false in the chat here. Agreed. They are not technologies that lead to 0 medication errors. They are technologies that have their place in the medication use process, and we're talking about how to make them more successful. And that will take us into our third objective. I'll hand it back to Julia.
Thank you, Heather. So we're going to go over recognizing technology support in the medication use process. So we're very familiar with, on the left-hand side, prescribing stage, transcribing stage, dispensing, administration, and monitoring. But another way that we could look at the medication use process is a continuum where communication is truly the key to making sure that we're optimizing safety and all of these. Next slide. So this is, again, another example on improving communication to prevent medication delays and medication errors. So learning from the EHR communication. This was a review of a medication requests from nursing to pharmacy from across a health system that identified that 20% of medication requests coming into pharmacy were blank. This led to a 5-minute survey that was sent to nursing and pharmacy departments throughout the health system. The goals of this survey were to assess the satisfaction with the current process, to collect recommendations from frontline staff on what the drop-down reasons should be for communication requests, and to elicit feedback on the medication request experience. The results were that at a scale from 1 to 10, staff, the satisfaction that they felt with medication request reasons was around 6. And the satisfaction they felt with medication request processes or pharmacy responses was also an average of 6.3 on a scale from 1 to 10. For new categories suggested, what was interesting was that staff reported at least 49% of the time that they would like to see a drop-down option that said new order, please verify. 51% responded that they would like to see medication stocked out, please refill as an option. And about a quarter responded that they would like to have order verified or profiled as a response from pharmacy. And so based on the reports from the survey, the communication that was sent in, the nursing and the pharmacy responses were optimized. And This did include credit previous dose not given as an option, IV to PO, verify order, and review and change route as options that nurses could send to pharmacy for communication. And from pharmacist response, there it was added, check the refrigerator, order verified and or profiled, and patient has been transferred as new options. Next slide. But again, because we need to make changes based on data and not just responses from surveys, there was a pre and post change review done to see if the changes in the medication request truly did optimize communication between nursing and pharmacy. So what was found was that in the pre-change, a 3-month period was reviewed, and only the top 3 nursing units that had the largest volume of medication requests per month were reviewed. Out of these, 37% of medication requests were for medication not in the automated dispensing cabinet. And the majority of medication requests overall, so somewhere between 26 to 40% of the time per each individual unit, the requests were coming in blank, and there was a free text that said verify. So what was found from the pre-change review was that communication was reviewed by both the pharmacists and the pharmacy technicians in the workflow. Majority of medication requests for these medication request heavy floors were ICUs. Approximately 1/3 of the requests were blank, but they did have a free text comment that said verify order. And technicians could not see these free text comments until they were processing medication requests. But once they process it, they could not verify the orders. And so they had to now escalate to the pharmacist. So the conclusion that was drawn was that using blank as a category for medication requests may increase delays in prioritizing this form of communication. It may increase phone call volume to pharmacy. It may impact pharmacy technicians' ability to triage requests. So post-implementation, between January 2024 and March 2024, again, the top 3 nursing units with the largest volume of medication requests per month were reviewed. Out of the 9 medication request units reviewed, only 1 had a majority for replace IV drip. This was a request coming from an ICU, and 34% of the time they would ask to replace the IV drip. The other 8 out of 9, so the majority of these medication requests overall, were for a new category that had been added that was new med, please verify. This was a range between 26 to 40% of med requests across all of these units. So the findings were that updating the medication request based on the survey feedback, these drop-down options were used. The ICU medication requests were primarily to request for verification of new orders, and the specific request for medication new med verify allowed pharmacy technicians to readily identify and escalate these to pharmacists rather than having to go into the request and then send it to the pharmacist. So the conclusion found was that reduction in both pharmacist and technician turnaround time to the response of these medication requests was observed because of using a very specific drop-down option from nursing to pharmacy. Next slide. So I do want to talk also a little bit on the impact of shortages and how there are safety risk points even when we have automation and technology. So we know that shortages can be caused both by internal or external reasons, and sometimes shortages may just be felt in one nursing unit rather than a true shortage. So we're going to focus specifically on pharmacy to nursing impact. There's external reasons. There could be manufacturer stockouts, recalls, withdrawals from market. There could be internal reasons, so not enough supply on hand in the hospital, increased use of that specific medication, increased census leading to a shortage of the medication. And then there's safety risk points. So we do need to identify that although we have alerts, we have so many processes, we have talked about nursing or pharmacy workarounds or behavioral drift that becomes common. So one thing that can happen during shortages is that a medication is now on shortage. The alternative product may look different or may be stored differently. So this could lead to look-alike or sound-alike, where in the past the medication was very clearly not a look-alike or sound-alike to another medication. Another example could be internal. So again, there's an increase in demand in the hospital. We run out of something. An example could be norepinephrine. It is typically premixed as a room temperature medication, but say now it has to be prepared in the pharmacy. It will have to go in an amber bag to protect from light. And so now this medication may look or sound, or rather look different than what the premixed bag looks like. Heparin is another room temperature medication, but again, if it goes on shortage, it again becomes a med that has to be mixed by pharmacy, and heparin is typically a high risk, high alert medication. So next slide. So in this example, this is a shortage of premixed heparin and premixed norepinephrine. Pharmacy would have to compound both medications and would have to add a new beyond use date label. In this case, let's say it's 7 days, and this bag has to be refrigerated to allow it to be good for 7 days rather than a shorter expiration time. This means that one of our risk points is a change in storage of location and 2 lookalike bags, because again, they're coming from the same pharmacy and they have the same standard pharmacy labels. In this example, there was a verbal order for a norepinephrine drip. The nurse overrode the medication and opened the refrigerator. These premix drips were previously at room temperature, but now they're in the refrigerator. The nurse believed that they removed norepinephrine, but they actually removed heparin and did not scan the medication barcode because this was an overridden medication, and so there was no order to scan it against. Patient ended up receiving heparin instead of norepinephrine, so in this case, it's a wrong medication given to the patient. So looking at impacts of shortages and where they can lead to errors, this is not just a human error, this is a system redesign that would have to be done. So we cannot depend on barcodes 100% of the time, but we actually have to, again, focus on communication, focus on where we're storing these, and always make sure that we're looking at what could go wrong when we're changing, optimizing, or making changes to a process or a medication. Next slide. So another type of shortage that could happen, in this case, this is a shortage of rocuronium and lidocaine. The rocuronium, let's say, is a prefilled syringes is the preferred formulation that an anesthesiology group would want to have. And lidocaine, at the same time, there's a manufacturer that shuts down, and there's a new lidocaine vial that looks just like the rocuronium vials. So now we have 2 different changes, one of them because of a shortage, the other one because of a manufacturer shutdown. It leads to purchasing 2 vials. And on the right-hand side, we could see that these vials on first inspection are look-alike vials. This is a procedural area, so they do not have electronic orders, and there is no pharmacy verification in their workflow. What this means is that in an OR, typically, we may not see BCMA scanning. Both the rocuronium and the lidocaine are available in the anesthesia workstations, but in separate compartments. In this example, the nurse anesthetist removes the medication by color. They're used to seeing it by color and is about to draw up the paralytic vial, but they notice that it is lidocaine they have in their hand and not rocuronium. So this is a little mix between an at-risk behavior where there's an assumption by color rather than looking at the vial, but also the impact of shortages, right? So we need to, again, focus on if there's a change, is there communication? Are we letting our staff know? And are we making sure that we are properly labeling and adding alerts wherever possible, especially in the absence of barcoding? And administration strategy or stage key points. So just like we have key points for barcoding, and we want to make sure that there are shortages, we also want to make sure that we're educating our staff. There is barcoding, but there's also how do we read these medication comments. So in a diet, we need to make sure that we're educating staff NPO versus NPO accept medications, right? Because the nurse may not know to go to the machine, get the medication, and barcode it if they believe this patient cannot have the medications. We also need to know about the diluent volume. We have our smart pumps that are programmed with specific concentration, specific volumes. So making sure that not only are we barcoding, but we're also programming it correctly, educating staff to educate patients, checking routes. Different routes mean that absorption will be different, even if it's the right medication, right barcode. Inspecting medications to make sure that visually they are not expired, they are not discolored, and then always addressing concerns, right? We need that feedback from frontline staff, which Heather has mentioned as well, and then emphasizing the importance of inspecting our medications and always following 5 rights despite all the automation and all the barcoding and technology that we work with now. And that leads us to our third and final question. So what are some forms of drifting behaviors and system support workarounds? Number 1, scanning patient wristbands and medication barcodes. Number 2, scan each patient and medication individually. Or number 3, scan after administration of the medication. So again, this is a drifting. Yes, correct. We're seeing some answers coming in, and they're all correct. Scanning after administration of medication is definitely a drifting behavior. With that, I believe we have 5 minutes, so we will open it up to any questions. You can either unmute or add to the chat.
And I will also
Great
go ahead.
presentation. Yeah, great presentation, you guys. If you have any questions, please feel free to stick them in the chat while Heather is going to tell you about how to get your CE.
Yes, thanks, Dorothy. Just wanted to remind everyone for the CE and evaluation after the presentation. So we're very thankful, Juliet and I, for you joining us this evening for our medication safety and technology CE. So there is a link from Lecture Panda that will have all of the information you need to claim CE. Please contact Tamika if you didn't receive the link. And I also wanted to remind everyone that this was just a 1-hour CE put on by the Medication Safety Forum of FSHP. And so it does not count for the 2-hour medication error CE needed for Florida. But this is our process here for claiming credit for joining us this evening.
So there's one question in the chat about how can they get the handouts for this great presentation. And I know that we're going to be putting them into, there we go. Tamika says in about a week, the recording and the handouts will be available on the education resources page on the FSHP website. And if you missed any of our previous presentations this year, they're also located there. Any other questions for the team?
I think that's another great point. This was our last presentation for this year as well. So we appreciate everyone engaging and giving us positive feedback on this.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, everyone. With that, we will say goodnight. And Heather and Juliet, wonderful presentation. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Dorothy.
Thank you.